Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today, Measuring Drug Testing ROI and Overcoming Collection Issues. If you have any problems seeing or hearing today's webinar presentation, please use the chat section. If you have any questions for today's presenters, they can be entered into the questions section. And these items are found on your dashboard that came up to the left or to the right, excuse me, when you joined our call. Today's presentation is being recorded and you will receive access to that recording. We'd like to thank today's sponsor, Recovery Track. And we also wanted to inform you all that today's presentation did qualify for continuing education credits from HRCI, SHRM, and from CCDAP for those who attend the entire live presentation. So stay with us the whole time and we'll send you an email afterward with how to apply for those credits. Today's presenters are Kirk Caesarly from Recovery Track and Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group. Kirk is the Chief Executive Officer at Recovery Track. He has 20 years of experience and proven excellence in information technology and technical management. He has extensive experience serving the federal, state, local governments, and healthcare industries with numerous success testing programs and proprietary applications under his belt. Kirk has perfected his ability to customize and design solutions for each and every customer. With us from the Current Consulting Group is Bill Current. He is the author of Why Drug Testing, which was updated and expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books of substance-related issues. He founded Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. He created Current Compliance, the most up-to-date and comprehensive online subscription database on all state laws related to workplace drug testing, including marijuana and workers' compensation law. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to Bill.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I'm really excited to once again be doing a presentation with Kirk Caesarly from Proof, from Recovery Track / Proof. I've been asked a lot lately on certain trends that are taking place in the drug testing industry and really in employee screening generally. I think there's some really exciting things happening in that regard. I think the future of how drug testing and alcohol testing are provided is in this sort of dramatic change, sort of a sea change that's occurring. You know, earlier this year, DOT on February 28th issued a notice of proposed rulemaking for lab-based oral fluid testing. I mean, that's been 20 years in the making, and those kind of things don't happen very easily. And yet now it's on the verge of becoming a permitted specimen for DOT covered testing. And during COVID, we saw a lot of companies really scrambling to find ways to keep their drug testing programs alive, despite the fact that a lot of services were being interrupted, especially collections. And I think that's where telehealth collections come into place. You know, there are lots of different words or names for this: observed at-home testing, remote video observed, and telehealth, of course, which is big now in medical treatment, etc. What I like about Proof, it's cutting edge. It's so easy to use, and Kirk and I are going to talk more specifically about the Proof app and its various applications. As you can see at the bottom, you can use saliva, breath, urine, nail, or blood with this. You know, different circumstances might necessitate a different type of test or a different method. And so we'll talk about those a little bit later when Kirk joins the webinar and we go back and forth with some Q&A. We do want to invite you though to ask any questions that you may have. Anything that you'd like to talk about today relative to telehealth collections, overcoming collection issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent trends in drug abuse and drug testing, and then we'll talk specifically about how to measure your drug testing return on investment and where something like oral fluid testing comes into play, or even a telehealth collection. And then we'll specifically address sort of the ongoing challenges that employers have, and as a result, their drug testing providers, when it comes to collection issues. If you think about the sort of the start to finish drug test process. Collecting a specimen has always been, sort of the key to getting a successful drug test result at the end of that process. And you hear people talk about, it's always been the weak link. I don't really consider it the weak link. I think there's a lot of dedicated professionals who are in that field and who collect specimens. I think because of a lot of other issues that are sort of beyond their control, we're seeing challenges with collections that are contributing significantly to really long delays in getting drug test results from laboratories in particular into the hands of those employers who want to make employment decisions. And so we'll talk about overcoming collection issues as part of today's presentation. Excuse me, but let's start with drug abuse and drug testing. Some of the slides I'm going to share with you, perhaps you've seen before, but they're going to be helpful in sort of setting the stage for where we're going with today's presentation. So we know that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration puts out a report every year on drug abuse trends. And so these are the statistics from the last one that came out last year. And they're always 1 year behind. So in 2020, it reports in 2019, but the results don't come out until after 2019 is done, as you would imagine. So these are the latest. If you look at the top, you see that horizontal blue bar, that's the marijuana line. And you can see that marijuana use, not surprising, increased from 2019 to 2020 pretty significantly, from 17.5% to 17.9%, which when you're talking about tens of millions of people, that's a statistically significant increase. Whereas with psychotherapeutic drugs like the antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, we saw a slight drop from 5.9% to 5.8%. And we're not talking about as big a pool, 16 million versus nearly 50 million. But nonetheless, it did go down. I think we might see that one go up when the 2022 report comes out, just because a lot of people have been using these psychotherapeutic drugs as a way to cope with some of the stress that's inherent with the economy situation that we have, the economic situation in our country, the sort of ongoing threat of COVID, which people are still dying from that, unfortunately. And so I think we'll see an increase there. And then you see the other statistics, I should say, for cocaine, hallucinogens, methamphetamines, inhalants, and heroin. So obviously, marijuana is still the #1 illicit drug of abuse in our country. We know that between 2002 and 2020, that long period of time, we saw a significant increase in adults 26 and older admitting to being regular users of marijuana, from 7% in 2002 to nearly 20% in 2020. Part of that's because the perceived risk of harm from smoking marijuana on a regular basis, weekly, declined from 36% in 2015 to 27% in 2020, nearly a 10% drop. That's significant because when people no longer have a sort of the deterrent of the fear that comes from doing something, they're more likely to do it. And as a result, it's, as you see at the bottom there, millions of people are trying marijuana for the first time. In 2020, 2.8 million people tried marijuana use for the first time. So marijuana use is up because the risk of harm is down, and every year there are millions of people coming into the sort of the marijuana use family. Now, every year Quest Diagnostics puts out a report called the Drug Testing Index that shows the positivity rates by drugs, by industries, by different categories, and it's really great information. I just pulled out one section on marijuana. So these are direct quotes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the positivity rates for marijuana in the general U.S. workforce, that's the non-DOT side of the Quest drug testing business, based on more than 6 million urine tests. That doesn't count their oral fluid or their hair tests, which they do both. So continued an upward climb, increasing 8.3% from 3.6 to 3.9 between 2020 and 2021. That's the highest positivity rate ever reported in the history of the drug testing index from Quest. Over a 5-year, over a 5-year period, positivity for marijuana in the general U.S. workforce, again, not counting DOT, increased 50% from 2017 to 2021. So a dramatic increase in positive drug tests for marijuana that coincides with a similar dramatic increase in marijuana use, according to the SAMHSA report. Now, it was particularly high in states that have legalized recreational marijuana, the recreational use of marijuana. States like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California, etc. 19 states altogether. It increased 118.2% between 2012 and 2020. So significant increases in positive drug test results for marijuana. Now, I don't have slides for it, but we also know that positivity rates for opioids and amphetamines have increased dramatically as well. One drug testing company showed an over 200% increase in positive results for amphetamines and opioids from random drug tests of safety-sensitive workers. So we know it's not just marijuana, but of course marijuana leads the way, and particularly in states that have passed recreational marijuana laws. So that brings us to drug testing. You know, which testing methods are best for drug testing under certain circumstances, pre-employment versus reasonable suspicion, and also for which drugs. And so, you know, when you think about the established legitimate drug testing methods, not the outliers, there's lots of new stuff coming out, but none of it's been, you know, vetted legally or scientifically. But the ones that have been around for a long time, you've got lab-based urine testing and point of collection urine testing, meaning the rapid result devices, meaning those, you know, instant result devices. You've got hair testing, which is a lab-based test. You've got lab-based oral fluid testing, and you've got point of collection oral fluid testing. Now, there are 3 methods so far that have been endorsed by the federal government, and by that I mean they've issued regulations or they've proposed regulations for that. So, of course, lab-based urine testing over 30 years has been the #1 testing method. It's right now, at this particular moment, the only testing method permitted by DOT. It's, you know, been around for over 30 years. It's legal in every state. There's no contesting the technology or the science, especially if you're using a certified laboratory like a Quest or a CRL laboratory, for example. There's also lab-based oral fluid testing, which was endorsed by SAMHSA in 2019 when they issued final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing of federal employees. But then also on February 28th of this year, DOT issued a notice of proposed rulemaking for lab-based oral fluid testing as well. So it's the only government-approved drug testing method that's capable of detecting recent drug use, and I'll explain that in a minute. And it's already legal in 47 states, maybe beyond that now that we have these federal guidelines from SAMHSA, because a lot of states simply defer to those federal guidelines, the 49 CFR Part 40 guidelines. And then there's hair testing, which is legal in most states. There was a SAMHSA notice of proposed rulemaking back in 2020. We've not seen a lot about it since then, but it's at least on their radar. The priority right now seems to be finalizing the DOT regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. But remember, I said at the same time, there's instant oral fluid testing and instant urine testing. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. You know, the equivalent perhaps of using a SAMHSA certified laboratory in the world of point of collection or rapid result testing might be to use an FDA cleared oral fluid testing device, you know, rapid testing. And so there are some out there, not very many, but there are some out there. And there are some FDA cleared urine point of collection testing devices as well. So there might be an equivalent there. But just by comparison, we won't go through all of this information right now. You've got, you know, sort of I'm adding blood to the chart here, urine, oral fluid, hair, and blood. Many states, most states don't allow blood testing for drugs as part of a standard drug-free workplace program, but under some circumstances, it would be allowed in, say, a post-accident situation where, you know, it's not possible to collect a specimen from an individual any other way. And then you've got the different characteristics on the left-hand column, lab-based or rapid result availability, window of detection, recent use detection, the ability to detect drug use within minutes after somebody's used the drug versus hours later or even days later in the case of hair testing. Is it legal by state? Are there SAMHSA regulations in place? And then the detection of other drugs. That's very important, right? I think personally it would be a sort of a grave error in business judgment to not test for marijuana in this particular environment where marijuana use is going up so dramatically. and positive results are going up along with it. But I think it would be equally dangerous to make a business decision to only test for marijuana and not test for cocaine and synthetic opioids and amphetamines, et cetera. So the ability to detect other drugs in a sample is very, very important. And you can see that all of these methods make that possible. Now, let's spend a few minutes talking about oral fluid for a minute. I just said that oral fluid testing is the only government endorsed drug testing method capable of detecting recent drug use. Here's why. With an oral fluid sample, it's possible to detect the parent drug, the drug itself, marijuana, let's say, to use as an example. Within about 10 to 15 minutes, marijuana becomes detectable in an oral fluid sample. We're not waiting for the drug to metabolize through the body. We're actually able, through either a lab or an instant device, to be able to detect the drug itself, often referred to as the parent drug. With other drug testing methods like urine and hair, we're waiting for the body to metabolize the drug, or for the metabolite of the drug to become detectable. In a urine sample, that's about 6 to 7 hours before that drug use is going to become detectable in a urine sample that's collected, within a short time after the person's used the drug. With hair, we're looking at a lag time of about 7 to 10 days before it becomes detectable in a hair sample. All three methods are great. I like them all. They all have different purposes, though, depending on what you're looking to do. For example, if you're in a state that's legalized marijuana and you're concerned about making a connection between a positive drug test result and recent use, the only government endorsed drug testing method that will meet that need that you have is oral fluid testing, particularly lab-based oral fluid testing. If you're looking more for lifestyle or historical drug use, then, and you're not necessarily concerned with whether somebody just smoked a joint during their lunch break coming back smelling of pot, then you can use urine testing or hair testing. They have their specific advantages and purposes. So, and that's true with all drug testing methods. Some drug testing methods beyond oral fluid, urine, and hair only have a window of detection of 2 to 3 hours. But if that's all you want to know, then fine. That's the drug testing method for you. But if you're looking at being able to detect for a longer period of time during the window of impairment, which for marijuana is like 3 to 10 hours, somebody's still going to be impaired by marijuana depending on a lot of factors, including what type of function you're asking them to perform. They may continue to be either cognitively or psychomotor impaired hours after the intoxication is worn off. The difference between intoxication is when the individual feels high from using marijuana versus the window of impairment where they may still be incapable of performing certain functions like operating a forklift or driving a delivery van. Despite the fact that they no longer feel high or intoxicated, they may still be impaired. And so a drug testing method that can detect drug use beyond that first 2 to 3 hours is probably the one that you're looking for if that's of a concern to you. Now, oral fluid's great for collections, easy to do. We're going to talk about that in connection with telehealth collections. And it's also one that virtually eliminates all types of drug test cheating, because every oral fluid collection from start to finish, it can be 100% observed, especially with the telehealth collection process, which Kirk and I are going to talk about in a minute. In the survey conducted by the Current Consulting Group, which we do every year, we just did our 24th annual drug testing industry survey, we saw a significant increase in drug testing providers saying that they're now offering oral fluid testing. So we know that oral fluid testing is gaining popularity, which has somewhat is because both SAMHSA and the Department of Transportation have come out and said, basically, we like lab-based oral fluid testing. We now have guidelines in place in the case of SAMHSA, or notice of proposed rulemaking from DOT, which signals that they're well on their way toward coming out with final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. And so that's influencing the drug testing industry, which includes your traditional drug testing third-party administrators, as well as background screening companies that also offer drug testing. I think oral fluid testing is a great offering for a background screening company, because there's a lot less involved in providing that service to your clients. And so I think we're just going to continue to see an increase in the percentage of providers, both TPAs on the drug testing side and background screening companies that also offer drug testing, being able to or being willing to offer oral fluid testing. It just makes a lot of sense for CRAs to do that. Now, let's look at two more things before we advance to our discussion of return on investment. So the window of detection impacts the return on investment. If you look at this chart here, you'll see breath, blood, oral fluid, urine, and hair. And the lines, the gray line, the red line, the blue line, the yellow, and the brown are the window of detection within the time frame that drugs are detectable in each of these samples. So with breath, you can see it's recent use detection, but it only lasts for a few hours, 2 to 3 hours at the most. With blood, it's recent use detection also. It goes out for a period of days, but it's not allowed in most workplace drug testing situations according to state law. It's just not practical, really. With oral fluids, you've also got the ability to detect recent use, and it goes out for days as well. But at the cutoff levels that we use, and for marijuana in particular, most of the oral fluid manufacturers, like OraSure, for example, will tell you that the window of detection is 24 hours or less on marijuana. And then you can see the window of detection for urine on the yellow line is moved off to the right from the left vertical line. That's because of that 6 to 7 hour lag time before a drug becomes detectable in urine because of the metabolite. We're looking for the metabolite as opposed to oral fluid where we're looking for the parent drug. And then hair testing, of course, a lag time of several days, but then a window that goes out for up to 3 months. So depending on what you're looking for, you may want to still do hair testing. Now, when you look at the window of detection and the window of impairment combined, you see that breath covers that first 2 to 3 hours of the window of impairment from marijuana. Urine is going to miss those first 7 hours, according to how we've got the chart laid out here. Oral fluid is the only one that's going to pick up recent use detection and then cover the entire 10 hours of the window of impairment. So somebody who's impaired at, say, the 1 hour, 2 hour mark, and somebody who's impaired at the, say, 8 hour mark are equally dangerous, depending on what you're asking them to do. In other words, you want a drug testing method that covers that entire window of impairment, so that somebody who's impaired on the job, and the drug test doesn't prove impairment, but it can create a correlation between, say, an accident that occurred, say, 7, 8 hours after somebody smoked a joint or a couple of joints during their lunch break, and the fact that they tested positive for the drug. Okay, so that's a lot of information to build up to our discussion of return on investment, which we're going to cover here in the next few minutes. So a lot of statistics here. I provide them here for you to be able to use at your leisure. It would, it's a whole hour-long presentation just to go through some of these stats, and we're not going to do that. But there are some great sources that can help you understand the cost of substance abuse in your workplace, which is important to know if you're going to be able to get an accurate sort of ROI from your drug testing program, an accurate view of that. So the one I like to use is a 2020 report from the University of Chicago that concluded that the average annual cost of each substance abusing employee is $8,817, about $8,800. And it includes costs associated with turnover, lost productivity, accidents, medical expenses, etc. Now, because marijuana users in particular are more likely to cause workplace accidents, file workers' comp claims, we got to look at those costs as well. So according to the National Safety Council, which is a great source for this type of information, go to their website, you'll find a lot of good stuff. The total one-year cost of work-related injuries equals over $161 billion. That comes out to about $1,100 per worker, but I'm really concerned about that $8,800 per drug-using employee. That the average cost of a work death in the workplace is $1.15 million, heaven forbid, and the average cost per medically consulted injury is about $39,000, right? So if we go back here, we see the average cost of each substance abusing employee is $8,800. But if you got one that had to be medically treated, then the cost for that accident is $39 million. And if somebody died, again, heaven forbid, it can be a lot of money to cover something like that. We know that drug users are more likely to cause accidents. We know that there's a lot of costs involved in that. And if it's a motor vehicle crash, say a drug impaired worker, and sometimes it's not even drug impaired, right? It could be any kind of a cause for impairment, but in this case, a drug impaired worker is involved in a motor vehicle crash. The average cost is $78,466 in workers' compensation. So making sense of these numbers. We know that drug users are more likely to be involved in an accident than a non-using employee. We know that they're 5 times more likely to file a workers' comp claim. We know that medically consulted injuries cost more. A workers' comp claim, the average cost is $41,000, but it can be a lot more than that. And if you're paying about $40 for a drug test, we can do a little bit of math here. Now, maybe you're paying more, maybe you're paying less. We'll talk about those costs with Kirk here in a second, but let's use $40 for our math today. Okay, so if a company's spending $40 on a pre-employment drug test, let's say, and avoids hiring just one drug user, one marijuana user or other type of drug, it'll reduce the cost of doing business by that average of $8,817 at least, right? But if you fail to screen that person out, if you decide you're not going to do pre-employment testing, or let's say in the case of marijuana, you're not going to test for marijuana and you hire that individual, the average cost is $8,800. But if there's a medically consulted injury or a vehicle crash, we know that the cost can be tens of thousands of dollars more than that. Okay, so let's look at measuring return on investment specifically as it relates to drug testing. And as I put these numbers in front of you, I do so knowing that some of you are paying more, some of you are paying less, that in particular telehealth collections can have a dramatic impact on some of these numbers. And so we'll let Kirk get into that. But let's just look at it from sort of a generic perspective. So this is the lab-based cost of drug testing, right? It doesn't include point of collection necessarily, although you can see how these numbers could affect that. So the price that an end user, the employer, pays for collection for urine, if you're sending that individual to an offsite collection site, let's say the average cost of that collection is $15. I know it can be less, and I know it can be dramatically more, right, on a weekend or off hours, the graveyard shift, etc. With an oral fluid test, I'm not necessarily sending anybody to an offsite collection. In fact, the majority of oral fluid tests don't involve sending somebody to an offsite collection. So I'm going to put $0 there. I'm going to have my own people do it, or in the case of a telehealth collection, I'm going to have that donor do it. They become the sort of the collector themselves, and we'll get more into that in a second. The price end user pays for the lab, let's say it's $18. It's bundled with the collection, the confirmation, and the MRO, or it's usually in conjunction with the collection, I should say, $18. On the oral fluid side, I'm going to be higher than that. I'm going to charge $25 because at this point, I'm incorporating the cost of the oral fluid collection device. Like in the case of OraSure, they have the Intercept device. With immunolysis, they have the QuantaSol device. So there's some cost for that device. And so I'm building it into this $25. And I'm not going to put any confirmation fees in here at this point. And so I am going to put an MRO fee for an average of $5 for positives and negatives. So that's a total of $38 at this point for my urine test through a laboratory and $25 for my oral fluid test through a laboratory. But those are the hard dollars. Let's look at the soft dollars, because this is where oral fluid testing in particular and telehealth collections can really have an impact on what your drug testing program really costs you. It's not just the invoice you're paying to your drug testing provider or that your client is paying to you, but it can involve some soft dollar losses as well. So I'm sending a worker to an offsite collection site. I'm paying that individual, let's say $10.10 an hour, and they're going to be gone on average $1 an hour and 50 minutes or an hour and a half. So my cost of lost work time to send that worker to a collection site is a little over $15. But if it's a reasonable suspicion test, I'm also sending a supervisor with them. I may be sending a supervisor with them anyway, but I'm paying that person, let's say $24 an hour. I know they can be a lot more than that. These are just some generic numbers I pulled out. And for an hour and a half, that's going to cost me $36 to send that individual to a collection site. If, on the other hand, I'm doing that collection at the workplace, then the lost work time is about 15 minutes. So it's, instead of $10.10 an hour, it's just a quarter of an hour. So it's $2.53. And for the supervisor, instead of $24, it's a quarter of that, it's $6. Now, telehealth collections would impact these numbers as well, right? Because I may be testing somebody who's not even in the workplace. That's the beauty of telehealth collections, is that it could be an individual who's working from their home. It could be an individual who's applied for a job and they're being tested from their home, all kinds of scenarios. And some of these numbers would be affected one way or the other, but they could go away altogether, right? And we'll ask Kirk about that in a second. But if I do it this way, I'm sending somebody to an offsite collection site for an hour and a half of lost work time versus 15 minutes of lost work time with oral fluid testing, which I can do in the workplace, then I'm adding costs of $51.15 on the urine side and $8.53 on the oral fluid side. And that comes out to a total of $89 of real costs for the drug test and the soft dollar loss of having people away from the job for an hour and a half on the urine side, $89.15, where on the oral fluid side, I'm looking at $33.53 for an oral fluid savings of 62.4%. Now, I know what you could be thinking, and I'm okay with any concerns or issues or objections you have to my example. Here's what I'm going to tell you though. I do a lot of presentations and I get asked all the time, Bill, 5 years from now, how are we going to be doing drug testing? And I'm basing this on being in the industry for 33 years, but also for having the current consulting group. We just celebrated our 24th anniversary. So I've been doing this a long time. And I really think we're headed toward oral fluid testing, primarily through telehealth collections, which are going to streamline the process and make it more economically efficient for employers to continue doing drug testing. Now, how's that relate to the legalization of marijuana or the legalization of other drugs? I don't know if you saw just in the news the other day, the city of Wichita, Kansas, just moved to decriminalize marijuana and fentanyl strips. So I don't know what they're thinking there in Wichita, but other drugs as well. I think oral fluid testing is a great match for that. And I think the market, the employers, we're talking about the employer market, is going to demand it because of all the things that are happening with the U.S. economy, and also with the fact that a lot of collection sites that we've traditionally relied on in the past simply don't want to be in the business anymore. So it becomes harder and harder to find a collection site where an individual can, wait in line to void a urine sample. I think we're seeing that part becoming more and more challenging, and we're sort of heading toward a new era in the world of drug testing. And a lot of it has to do with the whole collection issue. Remember, at the beginning, I talked about that process that starts with a collection and ends with an accurate drug test result being reported to the employer. But a lot of times on the collection side, that's where we're getting bogged down right off the bat. Sometimes it's the delay at the laboratory. We know that. That's been a big issue in 2021 and 2022. But it starts with the collection. And so you have options when it comes to the collection. It can be an offsite collection facility, which I've just talked about, lab-owned patient service centers, preferred provider networks, which a lot of companies have set up, third-party collection networks as well, on-site professional collections, which will, they'll come and they'll do it at your workplace, or they'll come in a mobile unit and do collections for drug testing as well as other types of tests. You can train your employees to do it, as in the case of oral fluid testing, or you can rely on this relatively new technology that's been around a little while, but still relatively new, especially in the workplace market, telehealth collections. And so I want to bring Kirk into the discussion now. Kirk, are you there to join us?
I am. Thank you, Bill.
So Kirk, let's talk a little bit about telehealth collections. I've got a slide coming up that says why telehealth collections. Why don't you walk us through this? What are the advantages? What are people telling you when they decide they're going to go with telehealth collections?
I think some of the biggest things in terms of why a telehealth collection over an on-site or off-site, where you're using a collector at a facility where a donor has to travel from their office, from their home to that site, or where the collectors travel to them. Some of the biggest advantages of the telehealth are going to be around efficiency. There's no scheduling that's required. Typically, they're going to take a lot less time to be conducted. So it's saving, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of work hours. In essence, they're actually more secure and more accurate. The telehealth collections are often guided through on-screen instruction sets, which are delivered the same way each and every time. So it reduces errors, potential human errors, and puts the onus really on the individual to just simply follow instructions that, again, are delivered the same way each and every time. In terms of availability, there's really no comparison. Telehealth collections, particularly in the Proof platform, which we'll talk about more in a minute, are open and available 24/7. So that's all hours of the day, not just during normal business hours. And often individuals that do need to get tested, it's more convenient for them to do it in the off hours. It also includes Saturdays, Sundays, vacations, holidays, you name it. Again, it's really available to the individual at any hour of the day, any day of the week. In terms of limits, also with telehealth, there really are very little in terms of geography. No matter where the individual is located, the collection can occur, again, where they are, not necessarily where the brick and mortar collection site is located. So someone can be in a very rural area and still get tested through a telehealth platform, which is one of the other big advantages, particularly as the workforce is moving remote, or if you have traveling workforces that really can't get to a metro area where the collection sites might be located.
Okay, so what type of company is most likely to find telehealth collections appealing to them?
Yeah, in my experience, particularly over the last 2 years, as we've been deploying Proof in more and more use cases, really virtually any company is a perfect fit for a telehealth collection. Many of the companies today, as during the pandemic, had to shift to remote offices, take folks out of the office, let them work from home. You know, that is a perfect fit. Companies that have remote workers, traveling sales individuals, or crews that go off-site to perform their duties, they also are a perfect fit. Small, medium, large companies, again, of all types, really. Anyone that wants to save time and save money, as we've been talking about ROI, really fits well in the category of a telehealth collection versus an on-site, off-site brick and mortar collection.
Okay, so I said earlier, and somebody has a question here on it, so I'll just interject it into our discussion here, insert it into our discussion, that it's a perfect match with oral fluid testing, but you could use other testing methods besides oral fluid with telehealth, right?
You can, and it really is kind of dependent on the telehealth platform. With Proof specifically, we do offer 5 different specimen types. And you've mentioned a few when you were doing some of your comparisons in terms of window of detection and window of impairment. Saliva, oral fluid, is our primary specimen type, but we do also offer a fingernail option, which is very comparable to where you referenced hair. They essentially are the same test process, same test panels are available. Blood is also an option using the finger prick method, where you are pricking your finger with a lancet, providing that blood droplets on a card and using what they call a dry blood spot to test the specimen. We also offer a breath option for immediacy detection, like you also mentioned with oral fluid, breath as well when it comes to alcohol. And that's also available in our telehealth platform. And then we do have a pretty exciting option that's a urine product. Most folks do say, well, telehealth typically involves video recording and/or video observation of the individual. How can you do that remotely and do that through a platform like Proof? The short answer is we don't record the urine process of collections. The individual does that off camera, but they do a buccal swab and oral swab on camera so that we get a DNA benchmark from the individual. And we can then test the urine that was collected off screen for not only drugs, but a DNA match. And that gives us that identity verification that we know the individual that provided the urine off screen matches the same individual that provided the oral fluid on screen.
Okay, so I'm going to keep inserting questions from our audience. So, you know, one of the things I said earlier, and you hear this a lot from the oral fluid testing people, is that, you know, it's virtually impossible to cheat on an oral fluid sample because, as the oral fluid testing people often say, the collector and the donor are right there face to face, and it's 100% observed. There's no opportunity for somebody to tamper with a sample. how does that work with Proof or with telehealth collections?
One of the very first steps with a telehealth collection, and specifically with Proof, is to do an identifying portion of the process where we have the individual provide their valid government ID. It can be a driver's license, a passport, other government issued IDs, and international versions of those also are verifiable, by the way. The next step after that is to do a facial recognition scan so that we can confirm the person on the ID who is part of the account truly is the individual that is on screen. With Proof specifically, once we have that pass of the identity verification, we go into the collection process where they're guided by the platform on each and every step. Each of those steps are video recorded and they're monitored through artificial intelligence to ensure the individual stays on screen, is looking at the application, the smartphone, the platform, the mobile app itself, and is conducting each of those steps properly. At any time they go off screen, there's artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, to detect that and timestamp it. And that's important because at the end of our process, what we do is review that collection for validate so that we can validate it and provide that detail back to the testing entity. In terms of some of the cheating that I think often people refer to is how urine is often fairly easy to substitute. Even under direct observation, there's various devices and methods that people have used in the past to do that substitution. That's virtually impossible, very difficult to do that with oral fluid. There is specimen validity testing with it, just like there is with other specimen types. So that's part of it as well. But the real key is to be able to see that individual 100% in a very, call it comfortable format, which it often isn't so comfortable in other collection types, such as urine. But you're able to do that through every step of the process with the oral fluid. And particularly with the telehealth, we have all of that documented. All of that is available, again, reviewed by a certified team that we have. And all the customers also have access to those materials. These are assets that you don't get when you're using other specimen types, and particularly when you're using a brick and mortar collection option.
Okay, so company decides we're doing oral fluid testing. We like the whole idea of telehealth collections and this advantage of oral fluid versus hair or urine, which is that, you know, it's just much more difficult, if not impossible, to cheat on an oral fluid test, is unchanged when it comes to telehealth collections. So still, you know, an advantage, even if you're doing oral fluid, but it's still an advantage even if you decide to do telehealth collections. So let me insert another. And actually, before I do that, I just want to show the audience that in the slide deck that you'll have access to later, there's a slide that kind of goes through what Kirk just explained to us, the process. And then, you know, again, some of the advantages to the Proof product specifically. But I wanted to put this one up here because I think until you see it, I know this was the case with me, that until you see it, it's kind of hard to imagine how this would work. You know, somebody's got an app on their phone or on an iPad or some other type of tablet, etc. But on, let's say, on a smartphone, you know, I mean, how's that work? I mean, I know now because you've shown me, you've demonstrated for me with the packaging and everything. But you know, I used to imagine, you know, my phone tipping over while I'm trying to do the collection, etc. And you know, breaking the chain of observation, so to speak. You know, and that reminds me, I do want to ask you about chain of collection, paperwork, etc. here in a second. But could you just walk us through? I know there are other products out there. We're doing this one with Proof. Can you walk us through how this packaging makes it possible to do your collection?
Absolutely, sure. And I'll just step back one quick moment and say, is, you know, the general process is, as you showed a little earlier, of course, this is the assumption that the partner, TPA, CRA, as you mentioned, or an employer that has an account directly is able to order their tests through Proof, through a portal, and choose by donor whether or not to have that kit, as you're showing right now, delivered directly to their home, to the office, handed out to the employees or to applicants applying for a position at the company. but hand those kits out to them directly, or again, have them shipped directly to their home so that they have those available, whether it's a random selection or whether it's a pre-employment test. When it's time for the individual to test, they do receive all of their login credentials and everything. As we described, this is a mobile application that they will download. That can be delivered very conveniently through email, through text messaging, really however the testing entity wants that communicated to their applicants or their employees. With the kit in hand, which you're showing right there, the box contains all of the collection materials that they will need. In a lab environment, that's going to be their lab-based kit, which you're showing two examples of from OraSure. It will include a chain of custody that they need to complete, just like they would in a brick and mortar collection scenario. It will include their return to lab shipping materials, clinical packs, specimen bags, and then the overnight labels. So essentially, it's really a drug test kit in a box, specifically, as you said, for the telehealth remote collection. The box itself also is very important in this process. When the test begins and the individual is first instructed to open the box, they're going to be told how to use that front flap on there where you can see a little bit of a black line. That's actually a little place for the individual to place their smartphone. When their smartphone is in that little slot, they're now hands-free, and they can watch, listen, and read all of the instructions on the app. It takes about 10 minutes from start to finish for them to do specifically an oral fluid collection. Most of our other specimen types are about the same time frame. So as we all know, 10 minutes is pretty quick. If you could get in and out of a brick and mortar facility in 10 minutes, I need to know that location so we can add them to our network. But in terms of the next steps with the phone in the actual slot on the box, as I mentioned, the app is going to start recording them while instructing them from start to finish. At the very end or very last steps after they've done, in an oral fluid example, swab their mouth for a couple minutes, they're going to package that up. I mentioned a specimen bag would be included, which will seal that up. The collection or chain of custody form will be included, which they will sign, and use a specimen vial seal off of that form to place over the oral fluid cap, the vial that needs to be returned over top of the cap of that vial. Then it's placed in the FedEx or UPS clinical pack that's returned to the lab with overnight label. And in about 24 hours, whomever is required to receive those lab results, they'll receive that from the laboratory just like they do today. In addition to that, as I mentioned, there are a few other assets with telehealth and specifically with Proof. They receive a collection report, which looks very similar to a lab report, but it's all things about the collection, verifying the identity of the individual, validating each and every collection procedure. And if there are recommendations on how to improve for the next time, those are included as well. And then last but not least, all of the assets in terms of the video itself that was captured during that collection is available as well.
Now, I asked you about chain of custody, so could you walk us through how that's going to work, seeing as there's not a collector in the room to help fill out the paperwork?
So the collection instructions do include how to, for the individual, how to go through the process of completing the chain of custody specifically. We actually have a customized chain that works with all of our lab partners, so it makes it very simple, easy. A lot less information is required when you're using a telehealth collection than when in facility. As you mentioned, the donor is the collector and vice versa. So we're able to remove a lot of the pieces of a normal CCF or chain of custody form. So the individual simply enters their personal information. That can be their name, of course, ID, number, the participant or employee ID that we're going to be using, key dates as to when they're doing it, and signing it. We also have an electronic version of this, by the way, for those that are able to use that and or prefer it. And of course, it's going to speed up that time for the total collection if you do end up using that. Other real key piece I mentioned earlier is on every chain of custody, electronic and or in paper format, is the specimen vial seal. That's how we identify the actual specimen with a unique number. And that is part of that form or included in the kit, so that at the right time, the application Proof can instruct the individual on how to use that. The app, by the way, also scans that ID and scans the tracking information off of the return label to the laboratory. So I didn't mention it earlier, but in addition to that collection report, we have a lot more information in terms of tracking and ensuring security and chain of custody around the specimen than we do with a brick and mortar process. We can tell you when the collection started, when the collection was completed, when it was picked up by the overnight carrier, when it was received by the laboratory, and then of course ultimately marry all of that information up when the lab results are available.
Okay, so the young woman on the screen here looks pretty happy, but anybody who's been through a drug test, and I've been through lots of them during my working life, you know, sometimes they can be a little bit stressful, even if you know you haven't been using drugs. You go through the process, and so my question here is, you know, what if the donor, you know, gets a little bit confused? What if they make a mistake? What happens then? Because you know, the employer still wants to get that drug test done.
Yeah, we have a very quick turnaround time in terms of delivering the collection kits to the individual. We do have options to include multiple devices in the event that a scenario like what you described comes up. Some of those scenarios where an issue could occur, it could be technologically as well, not just on the donor themselves. In those examples, those are automated in terms of detection, and so the individual donor can be notified immediately that we need to cease that collection and start a new one. In terms of just, as you said, she looks pretty happy. You know, I would tell you in our 2 years and about 40,000 collections through the Proof platform, we're right now at about a 98% success rate. So that equates to about 98 individuals out of 100 from start to finish are able to get their collection done with 100% accuracy and or the collection is valid. We do here our own testing as well. We do some in facility, and I don't have nearly that type of success rate with brick and mortar collections. So in terms of, you know, the risk of what you ask about, it's very, very low. In more situations than not, I would say there are issues with the individual's cellular access, Wi-Fi access, or something to do with their smartphone. The actual instruction steps are so easy to follow. The individual sees the instruction on screen. They actually hear it as well. Each instruction step is read to them. And they also see a visual representation of what they are supposed to do. And if any of those steps are where they are supposed to do something such as swabbing their mouth, the on-screen instructions that they see visually are actually animated so that they can really get a full feel and understand 100% what they're supposed to do. So to date, we've had very good success with that. And in terms of overall, like I said, satisfaction from the individual, we get very positive responses from the donors because they too see that we're saving their time. We may be saving them money in the end, but they don't have to go to a facility where there might be other individuals that are there for health reasons, COVID, you name it, and just in an environment where they are undoubtedly going to have to wait for a long period of time just to get that collection completed.
Perfect. Now we're getting close on time and there's more questions from our audience that I want to get to, but just before we do that, I have one other question, which is that we are seeing a healthy percentage of drug tests. It's not a dominating percentage by any means. You know, the majority of drug tests today are still lab-based urine tests. We're seeing a pretty significant increase in oral fluid testing, but some companies, under some circumstances, maybe a growing percentage of companies, would prefer a rapid result drug test. So I know we're doing a little bit of shameless product placing here for OraSure, but you know, for a company that wants to do a point of collection rapid result test, you know, the latest technology that's out there that relative to that is, you know, not having to rely on a supervisor in the workplace to determine what the result of this rapid test is. Is there a line there? Is there not a line? You know, so if somebody's using Proof or some other telehealth, well, let's say Proof, you know, a telehealth collection process with Proof, but they want to do point of collection. One, is that possible? And then two, who's going to read the result? Is that this young woman here, or how's that going to happen?
Absolutely, it's 100% possible, and it's one of our newest options. It's still part of the specimen type oral fluid, as you mentioned, but of course differently in terms of the determination of the result, point of care versus lab-based. So as you said, the immediacy not only of detection but of results is available. So the proof instruction sets are customized for a point of care oral fluid device. Steps are pretty much the same in terms of how the collection occurs, but the key element, as you said, in a brick and mortar facility or on site at an employer location, you need an individual to read the point of care device. With proof at the very end, the very last step, the individual actually is presenting that device to the application, and the application proof is going to read that point of care result for us, for the individual. It doesn't show that determination to the individual donor, and there are reasons for that. We don't want them to know at that state whether or not it is positive or negative, or non-negative, I should say, versus saying positive. It's just presumptive at that stage. But it will read that. And then we have automated options for end users of proof to tell us whether or not they want that device now confirmed via a lab-based process. And so one of the following steps to proof reading that point of care device where it's presumptive positive or non-negative can be to use the included materials to package that point of care device up and ship it to our lab partner for a full lab confirmation. So as your primary topic is return on investment, proof can deliver a huge amount in terms of when using point of care. They're less expensive upfront. If it's negative, we don't really have to do any more steps after that. Still could be sent in for a final confirmation if wanted. But in terms of the time and the money that it can save, that is a great option, and it is brand new for us.
Okay, and we're just down the last 2 minutes. Rapid question answers period. What if we're seeing a growing percentage of employers that don't want to test for marijuana? I suppose that's yeah, in other words, you could use any type of a panel, right? It would depend on the type of testing that they're doing.
Absolutely. Our panels are fully customizable. You can request those to include or not include marijuana as a simple example, but absolutely 100% customizable.
And it would include, I guess, companies that want to do opioids or other drugs that are not part of like a SAMHSA 5 panel.
Absolutely. 5 panels, 7, 9, 10, you name it. It again is a full customizable options, but of course we have recommendations that we can make for panels that are ready to go today, or we can customize them as needed.
Okay. Let me apologize to a good, dear old-time friend of mine, Dean Classy, who asked a question, because he had a great question, but we don't have time to go into the full explanation. I apologize, Dean, but I will answer your question for you. It has to do with oral fluid testing with the federal guidelines, mandated testing beyond DOT. But there is one more I want to get to, Kirk, from our audience, which is, are these materials available in other languages? Is this just English? Can you provide Spanish, for example?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and we do have a Spanish version for proof. We also have other languages available, and we have about an option, roughly about 40 different languages as an option that we can provide if needed. Spanish is by far our second most usable one, of course, with English being first. And a real quick note, we do have end users that have mobility issues. So we also have a caregiver version in the event it's an elderly person, or again, somebody maybe with a disability where they may not be able to swab their own mouth. And so proof can speak not only to the donor, but also to the caregiver. So we do have other use cases besides a very traditional, call it English single donor version. And that's a great question, and proof is available to, in Spanish.
Okay, and then real quick, is it possible to test for anabolic steroids?
Through our urine DNA, that is absolutely possible. To be honest, I would tell you I'd have to do some digging just to confirm whether or not steroid options are available within oral fluid. But we do have a telehealth option through our urine specimen type where definitely anabolic steroids can be included.
Okay, and I apologize to anybody else. I see there's other questions. This is where we're going to have to cut it off. Thank you, Kirk, for all that great information. You can see Kirk's contact information there, ours as well. If you have questions, outside of the telehealth topic, we'd be happy to discuss any of those state law questions, etc. Let me just turn it over to Jessica now to walk us through the conclusion. And again, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill and Kirk. As we conclude today's webinar, we want to remind you that today's presentation did qualify for credits from HRCI, SHRM, and from CCDAP for those who attended the live presentation in its entirety. And we will email you that information as well as a link to the recording from today's presentation so you can review this information again. We also want to thank you for coming to our Current Consulting Group's webinars, and especially thank Recovery Track and Proof for sponsoring today's webinar. And with that, this concludes our webinar. Have a nice day.